I don't know what it is with Polish developers and FPS games. I mean, People Can Fly worked on the Painkiller series, Techland worked on Call of Juarez and Dead Island, and Flying Wild Hog worked on Hard Reset and, case in point, the Shadow Warrior reboot with the recently released Shadow Warrior 2. It was 2 years ago when Flying Wild Hog took a stab at rebooting one of the greatest FPS games of all time with mixed results, and now in 2016 they're back at it again with the sequel. And according to the internet, it's a huge success, right? Well, yeah, I guess it kind of is, but if you had issues with the last game, then this one is hardly going to win you over. Though having said that, in a lot of ways, it also makes some very bold changes which really differentiate it quite a bit from the first game. The story again centers around Lo Wang, a wise-talking, ass-kicking Yakuza enforcer who finds himself in deep shit when he attempts to rescue Kamiko, the daughter of a powerful Yakuza boss, from his arch-nemesis Zilla, only to have her soul suddenly transported into his head where she babbles on constantly like a spoilt little brat.
Are you serious?
From there, Lo Wang forms a tenuous alliance with the Yakuza and a bunch of demons, carrying out missions for all of them as he attempts to free Kamiko and reunite her with her mutated body. Cinematics are frequent and delivered through Lo Wang's eyes, where you'll do little more than just stand in one place for 5 minutes as people talk. Now, I'm not one to look down my nose at lowbrow humour. I mean, I grew up with films like Billy Madison and Happy Gilmore, but I gotta say that the humour in this game is just kinda stupid. It just seems that every single line of dialogue uttered by Lo Wang is trying to be funny, whether it's making some kind of sarcastic remark when someone is telling him crucial plot information, or one of his bizarre non sequiturs that just misses the mark entirely.
Maybe I'll pick up some dinner while I'm at it.
I would not recommend eating them.
It's almost constant throughout the entire game, and even during some of the more serious cinematics, characters just make these out of place jokes. Now, I know the original Lo Wang was a huge smartass, but it kind of worked in that context because he wasn't talking all the time. You'd blow someone up with a grenade launcher and he'd just chuck in a quick one-liner, but when the character is talking constantly, to have every second sentence contain some kind of dick joke or sarcastic quip, it just becomes unfunny very quickly.
Does that mean okay?
It's gonna mean no balls for you if you don't shut your yammering mouth.
Anyway, this narrative style also affects the structure of the campaign as well. Compared to the first game, which was a lot more linear, this time around you've got a map screen which highlights where you'll be going for both the story and side missions. All of the missions send you to one of 3 or 4 different open world style areas with enemy and item placements randomized each time you return, encouraging exploration to collect more loot. Though all of the best guns and items come from the mission rewards, not from being found in the levels. More importantly though, completing these side missions earns extra skill points to unlock and upgrade all of Lo Wang's skills, most of which are pretty run-of-the-mill, like more health points, faster movement speed, or more chi. Chi being the mana of the game used to cast Lo Wang's various abilities. And you're really going to want to upgrade Lo Wang's skills because this is a pretty damn challenging game at times, especially if you're playing the game on the higher difficulties, which you bloody well should be. And yet again, it disappoints me to say that Flying Wild Hog seem to think that the only way to make a game difficult is to throw lots of enemies at the player at once. It's something they did quite obnoxiously in Hard Reset, it's something they did again in Shadow Warrior, and now they've done the same thing again with Shadow Warrior 2. You'll be frequently taking on droves and droves of enemies, though unlike its predecessor, you've actually got the ability to simply avoid them entirely, and just run right past them. Well, most of the time anyway. And again, like the first game, the combat often falls apart in a lot of ways due to some horrible balancing issues and just some plain unfairness in certain scenarios, where you're quite often just getting bombarded from every single goddamn direction and it becomes impossible to not take damage. And they've even included suicide bomber type enemies, because who doesn't like an enemy that runs right up to you and blows the hell up? Now, the gameplay is really reminiscent of Borderlands to me, where you're leveling up and going around looting chests constantly for cash and items, but also in the way they've given all the enemies health bars, with some of them having vulnerabilities or immunities to elemental damages like fire, acid, and electricity. Using the many upgrade components you come across dropped by fallen enemies, you can give certain weapons certain parameters to fit in with each element, giving you an edge during combat. This is, however, more confusing than it is coherent, because you might be fighting an enemy that's weak to fire and immune to acid, but also be fighting the same enemy type who happens to be weak to acid but immune to fire. You know what I'm saying? And it just becomes this sort of clusterfuck of confusion as you're swapping back and forth between elemental spec weapons. It honestly becomes easier just to choose a weapon with a high DPS and forget about trying to match elemental types to enemies. Again, like the first game, there's a real focus on melee combat over using ranged weapons, and thankfully this time there's a whole heap of different melee weapons you can get your hands on, not to mention a bunch of guns as well, all of which look awesome. Guns again though just kind of take a backseat as they're largely much less effective on the whole, even when you put a fair few upgrades into them. You'd think something like a minigun or a rocket launcher would really do some damage, but they all just feel a little bit underpowered. The only time you really have to use them is during boss fights. Now with the swords, you've either got the basic slash attack, which does bugger all damage and is often quite useless because most enemies can parry it. There's a charged up 360 type attack returning from the first game where Lo Wang spins around hitting everything in his vicinity. An attack which is utterly suicidal at high difficulties as you're vulnerable when you activate it. The only real useful attack I found is the stab, where you thrust forward doing massive damage to whatever you hit, which when fully upgraded can kill most standard enemies in a single hit. Chopping things up with the sword though is a whole heap of fun, and the chunky sound effects when you cut something in half as blood spurts all over the place is gory and great to behold. Lo Wang's abilities don't really help all that much either. You've got a couple of offensive spells and a couple of defensive ones as well, where you can heal yourself over time and vanish for a few seconds if things get too heated. The most effective ability though is Shadow Warrior, which is kind of like a rage mode where the screen goes all red for a bit and you can cause massive damage in this time. Even still though, man, the enemies in this game are total bullet sponges, or sword sponges if you will. Often it can take minutes to kill every enemy in the area, not because it's difficult, but because their health points are so goddamn high. And there's so many of them to deal with at once, you're just constantly dashing around the place, whittling their health down in between taking massive damage from the shoddy hit detection. Because of the open world design, it's common to accidentally aggro another bunch of enemies as you're trying to backpedal away from the current dozen attacking you, causing the fight to go on even longer. I mean, this might sound fun, but sometimes it just becomes really frustrating. The boss battles are a battle of attrition with how long you can mash that shift button to avoid getting pummeled. Visually, I'm not sure I'd say this game looks any better than the first game. I mean, if anything, it's about on par, which isn't really an insult because the first game looked pretty much amazing. Performance-wise, it seems to run pretty well, though I am running it with 16GB of RAM, a GTX 1080, and an i7 6700K, so most games are bound to run pretty well on that kind of hardware. The environments and weapons look great, but the character models look really sloppy, like something from 7 or 8 years ago, and there's lots of clipping issues where hands and hair go through clothing and other objects they shouldn't go through. As a side feature, it's also entirely possible to play the game in co-op mode as well, which is a nice addition, though I'm surprised there's no way to communicate with other players in-game, and the screen for inviting a friend isn't alphabetically organised, so have fun scrolling through the couple hundred friends on your Steam list trying to find that one person you want to play with. Rounding the whole thing up, I want to make it clear that I don't dislike Shadow Warrior 2, but the whole thing is just so meh. The humour in the game often falls flat on its ass, the combat gets the job done, but the reliance of melee weaponry often limits the experimentation and overall fun you get to have. And visually, like I said, it looks about the same as the previous game. Overall, the whole thing is okay. I mean, it's about the most okay game I've played in recent memory. However, it's half the price of a standard FPS game with a campaign that's twice as long, so the price is right and it's definitely playable in the very least. It's just the whole thing feels so uninspired. In terms of a first-person shooter, Shadow Warrior 2 is definitely up there with the better ones. It's just lacking something that needed to propel it into greatness.
Mess with the bull, you get the way.